Imagine for a moment the childhood of every talented, world-changing, and revolutionary person you can think of. Most have a fairly average, middle-class life like Steve Jobs. Some have a more prosperous childhood filled with every human necessity and their own extraneous desires, like Bill Gates. But for the most part, they had all that they need to grow up to be the world-changing people that they were. Now imagine what those same people's lives would have become had they grown up in a poor family, with many obstacles that stopped them from living up to what they were made for. Imagine smart brains like Albert Einstein not being able to think properly because they've been too emotionally stricken by their parents' hardships or other outside traumatic forces. They will never be able to become smart. They will never be able to change the world in these scenarios. It is tough to think of an alternate world without these innovators, a world without our today's advances in technology, school, and society. What would the world be like if everyone had a perfect childhood? How much can a person be influenced by outside forces? I am Artem Bagatica from Fairfield Ludlow High School, and in this podcast I'll be discussing the debate of nature versus nurture, along with my own thoughts on certain aspects. So, one of the most common questions that people ask is, why do children behave as they do? Or in other words, how much is hardwired in their nature and how much is shaped by nurture? Personally, I stand with nurture. I believe that children are hardwired to act as themselves, to react to things as they are built to do. I also believe that society very much influences these children in that their thoughts can be manipulated and changed by the expectations of other people. For example, some kids might not be sensitive to things, like the death of their relatives, as they're simply not meant to be sensitive. Those kids might just go on with their life and think that their behavior is normal. However, since that's not the type of person that fits in society, those kids will live very sad lives, being excluded from others. In these kids' cases, the parent's job is to notice a child's strange behavior and help them solve their hardships. But what if a parent can't? This brings up the next question. Why do good families sometimes produce bad children, or at least flawed children? The answer to this, I think, is very simple. It all goes down to the parenting style that the kids grew up on. If a child spends their whole life subject to painful beatings or a very abusive childhood with bullies at school, chances are they'll grow up emotionally ruined. Personally, I deeply sympathize towards these people. I actually think of these types of questions a lot. Imagine two bright people, very, very bright, like Albert Einstein. They have the best emotional and mental intelligence. Both have the potential to grow up successful and happy. One of them grows up in a perfect home. They have all the resources and equipment like whiteboards and computers to help them grow smarter, and the other grows up in a terrible, messy neighborhood with drugs and bad influencers around them. So it's clear that the latter is not going to live up to what they're made for. In Jacob's case, he did have an abusive childhood. Well, not domestically, but in school he did, with Ben bullying him for being gay and all of that. That type of pressure, that influence is what forms negative reactions and deep hatred. That being said, it might not be the parents' fault if they produced bad children. It might just be their DNA. So, a few classes ago we were talking about the three main points that make up a serial killer. I have my notes right here, and this is 3 ingredients that make up a serial killer by James Fallon, who had a history of parents being violent. So number 1, dark patches in the frontal lobe. Number 2, family history of the MAOA gene, which is basically a gene that sends out a strong need for violence in a person. And number 3, childhood abuse and traumatic events. So just focusing on the last ingredient, that second version Albert Einstein I was talking about earlier, he had the potential to even be a serial killer, or at least have some violent tendencies. Also, Fallon says that a person can be a serial killer simply if they have the MAOA gene. So people like Jacob, whose father had the gene, can appear normal and calm, but suddenly when the MAOA gene steps in, it can flip their whole attitude, which, by the way, is most likely what happened with Hope at the beach resort in Jamaica. Jacob probably had a random burst of energy and killed Hope unexpectedly. But this isn't Andy's fault. It's just his genes. Jacob is naturally violent. It's just an unfortunate gene that got passed on in the family. That being said, what should parents do to defend their kids? According to Very Well Family, a child behavior expert can rule out any mental health issues that may be behind the behavior problems. After all, Mr. Barber said, quote, "You get what you get," meaning you get what child you get, basically. So, I think it is necessary for parents to do whatever they can do to defend their kids. It's their nature, like a parent will literally do anything they can to defend their kid. The family's bloodline, their DNA, it must be passed on to the next generations. That's what is human nature. That's what parents naturally, think. And if a person like Jacob destroys or disrupts that flow by living in jail and not having kids of his own, it completely ends that family. It's a natural human feeling. People want to have their last name stay. We all want or should want our names to cause a positive effect in the world, sort of like our legacy. It is the reason why parents put in so much effort into their children, because they want to make their lives better, and they also want to make themselves better, because if their child grows up to be smart and leads to a positive change in the world, the parent will be known. The smart child is like a result of themselves. So when a child shows any sign of trouble, it's instinctive for parents to fix them. They don't want a defect in their history, and obviously they don't want their child to be the last generation of their history. In conclusion, I believe that nurture does outweigh nature in that, like I said, a person's life can change due to outside forces such as their childhood and parents. Therefore, the factor that has the most effect on a child's life is the parenting style that they grew up with. I am Artem Bagadikov from Fairfield Ludlow High School, and thank you for listening to my podcast.